Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America. Citizens in Action tonight proudly presents former two-term Congressman representing the 20th District from Westchester, Joseph J. DioGuardi. Former Congressman DioGuardi is a very special kind of congressman in that he was the only congressman ever elected to Congress that was an active CPA. He worked for Arthur Anderson for 22 years, and for the last 12 years of that term, he was a CPA. Now, I guess you could all figure out why we have a congressman or a former congressman with CPA background. Taxes today and failure to maintain budgets and the physical crisis that we have in this country and in all the states in this country are running us into havoc. And we have a man who has the capabilities and the expertise to give us some of the answers. In fact, the Honorable DioGuardi wrote a book which will be coming out in February, and the title of the book is Congress, It Doesn't Add Up. Congressman DioGuardi.
Thank you, Joe. Nice to be here. One small correction. You said 22 years at Arthur Anderson. For the last 12, I was a CPA. I was a partner in the last 12. I was a CPA, I guess, for about 20 years. But you're right, there is fiscal havoc in America today. It was there, by the way, when I was in Congress, and it wasn't new to me. It was there before, and I think the public is getting fed up with it, and that's why I wrote the book. It took me 2 years to put in one book my experience as a 22-year accountant, CPA, and a 4-year congressman, and I think I'll hit a big nerve, because there's no question in my mind that the mismanagement, that the spending habits of this country, of our government, are such that if we don't control government spending and taxes, this country will become a second-rate power. There are many aspects to it, and one of the chapters in the book, by the way, I lead off with a hard-hitting chapter where I take a congressman's voting card, because many people don't realize that a congressman votes, or a congresswoman, with a plastic card that's just like a credit card. And one day when I was voting with this card, I realized that it really is a credit card, because every time we put this card in for a government program or for an appropriations, we know that there's not enough money. That's why we have deficits every year. This year's deficit, or next year's deficit, fiscal year 92, is estimated to be $350 billion. That's with a B. So this I call, as I do in the first chapter of the book, the most expensive credit card in the world. And you know what's worse than that? This card doesn't have a limit. Yours has a limit, because when American Express, Diners, MasterCharge, Visa, whatever, calls you when you've reached your $2,000 limit or your $5,000 limit, you know that fiscal reality has arrived. With this card, all they do is they raise the debt ceiling in the middle of the night. I was there many times when they did it 2 o'clock in the morning, so they can float more bonds, so they can spend more money. And where do you think the bill goes? To the next generation with those bills, with those bonds that I call IOUs.
Speaking about floating the debt and all this fancy bookkeeping and this tricky accounting, we don't have any accountability. I mean, you have different departments in our government that just keep playing games. For instance, New York State, for example, is coming out now, in order to make the budget look better, they're coming up with a new plan to defray the budget over a 4-year period so that Governor Cuomo looked good in his presidential bid. Now, isn't this playing games with numbers? And like I told you, statistics don't lie. With numbers, you could do anything you want if you know how to play the game. But what's happened is people have been playing a game with the lives and the resources of the American people. And we're talking not the rich or the very poor, we're talking about the American middle class. We're the hammer in between the anvil. We're getting smashed.
No question, Joe, and it's more than just what you said. It's really deception. It's deception of the highest order. In fact, you might even call it fraud, because if a public corporation today that sold shares to the public, publicly traded corporation, used the accounting system that government uses, the officers of that company would be indicted, convicted, and hauled off to jail. That would be securities fraud. We are still in the United States government using a Mickey Mouse accounting system called a cash basis. We took New York City off that system in 1975 because of the crisis we had then. That was part of the deal that was made. And we still use it in the federal government. Why is it a fraudulent way to account? Well, because you can manipulate it. You can accelerate income, you can defer expenses, and they did that last year. You remember to balance the budget on the Graham-Rudman, they deferred 1 week's payroll of the military? Well, what do you do the next year? 2 weeks? And then 3 weeks? And before you know it, it's like the Ponzi scheme we have with bonds today. Because as we have more deficits, we create more bonds. That's the national debt, which is now almost $4 trillion. That's with a T, trillion. The deficit next year, I said, is $350 billion, but those deficits add up into the national debt. This is now being put on the next generation. That's a big burden for our kids to handle. And another point you mentioned earlier, before the program, let me remind our listening audience that the interest that we paid out to third parties on the national debt last year was almost $200 billion. And that money doesn't go for roads, doesn't go for jobs, it doesn't go for anything good. In fact, a lot of it goes to West Germany and Japan, and they recycle it back here, and they're buying some pretty good properties with it. So I just wanted to say that the accounting system, we don't have a capital budget, believe it or not, and we spend $200 billion a year on buildings, equipment, and weapons. New York City had a capital budget, but they were misusing it. We have a Mickey Mouse accounting system. We don't have uniform accounting systems. We have multiple systems, and when you try to put these multiple systems into incompatible computers, what do you get? You get reports that even CPAs like me couldn't understand in Congress for 3-4 years. And how can the public understand it? That's why the public is fed up. That's why this is going to be, Joe, the issue of 1992 and the 90s. And that's why I wrote the book, Congress, It Doesn't Add Up, because I wanted to unbundle this in words that the public could understand.
Well, Congressman, you mentioned $200 billion in debt. Isn't that really a fraudulent statement? The
Actually,
real
$4 trillion in debt.
No, well, I'm talking about, I meant the interest. Excuse me. We pay $200 billion in interest. Really, isn't it more like $390 billion if you really look at how they play the game with the debt? In other words, we borrow from the Social Security Fund and all the different trust funds,
Absolutely.
And we just put an IOU in the box. Now, who's going to pay the interest on those IOUs? That debt has to come due sometime.
Absolutely. In fact,
So then we're, in reality, we're not talking $200 billion. We are talking closer to $390 billion.
probably, Joe, because I was counting what we paid out in cash. And what you pay out in cash, you have to float new bonds, by the way, to get that cash. So in effect, you got interest on interest. But you're right, we have taken out cash from certain kinds of trust funds, and we've replaced that cash with IOUs, because literally, we have used the Social Security surpluses to reduce the deficits because it's gone into other spending programs. That's not right, and I don't think the public really realizes that. And by the way, there's another gimmick that was played. President Carter put the Social Security tax base and the rate on automatic pilot in 1980. Do you remember that? Because every year it's gone up without you having to vote on it. No one's voted on it. It just went up for 10 years. So that over a 10-year period, we have shifted some of the income tax to the Social Security tax. Now, maybe that wouldn't have been so bad if they left the Social Security taxes in the trust fund, but they took those out and spent them on something else. So they really disguised what they were trying to say with tax decreases on the income tax by increasing the Social Security tax, and they took the money out. The biggest shell game in the world, and it's being played right now in Washington.
Well, I mean, again, I have to go, there's no accountability. And the average Joe Blow like myself, we're here, we know something's going wrong. I mean, we realize it, we feel it. We can't believe all these giveaways every 2 minutes. Well, I'll give you an example. Just today, they're talking about coming up with a health plan that's going to cost $600 billion. Where is this money coming from? They're talking about a national health plan, and I heard a doctor on CNN on Crossfire. He said, "Well, if you don't use our plan, it will end up costing you $1 trillion." These guys throw $600 billion and trillions around like it's a nickel.
Joe, there's no question we need a better healthcare policy and strategy for America. But we need managed healthcare. We need efficiently administered healthcare, and we need to build a better safety net, because you're right, everybody does need to know that in a disaster, they're going to be covered. Nobody wants to see anybody on the street, but we can't keep shoveling money at everything mindlessly. We have to look in a qualitative way, what's working, what's not working, and invest in those things that work and make them more efficient. That's what a businessman would do. That's what I did for 22 years, and that's what I'm trying to do right now as a citizen, and I'll run again, and you can be sure I'm going to try to do that as an elected official.
Well, there's a case in point. Ray Kerrison in today's New York Post, and today is the 13th, by the way, the 13th of November. We don't know when this will be aired, but the 13th of November. Ray Kerrison, for example, was talking about Mayor David Dinkins. He's going to Johannesburg to tell the ANC how to put their house in order, in fiscal order. And Ray Kerrison laughs. He says, the only thing you could do at this point in time is laugh, because the man is hilarious. He left New York in such a shambles, and he goes to Johannesburg. Now, here's the point. The point is that...
Let me give you a bigger laugh than that, Joe. It's Mario Cuomo saying he's going to put Washington in order when he's made New York State into a disaster zone. Worse than Dukakis.
But we want to get down to facts and figures rather than name-calling. And the facts and figures are that 10 years ago, New York City operated with $12 billion. Now, I realize there's an inflation, but now it's a $27 billion budget. We have less services in terms of firemen, policemen, sanitation, parks department. But what we do have, when you look, we have more people on the welfare rolls. And what's happening is the people on the welfare rolls aren't really the beneficiaries. It's the bureaucracy that's been built up to service this welfare system that is free, that's taken off all the money. And to give you an example, and these are figures I'm citing from memory, and Kerrison's column today, he quotes the Craig report. There's that Craig report, which is a Wall Street report, and he quotes Craig as saying that in New York it costs for every recipient $1,038. And for comparable cost, the next closest state or city is Los Angeles, which does the same thing for $238. So what happened to the $800? That's $800 per recipient. We're talking billions and billions of dollars of sievage, stuff going through the strainer. I boiled macaroni tonight, and I put the spaghetti in the strainer, and the water came out. But we have strainers going out and taking all our money. I mean, something has to be done. I'm making light of it, but it's really a tragic thing.
Well, and the public is getting onto it. That's why you're seeing today incumbents being removed. Hey, that's why you saw right here in New Jersey, for the first time, I think, in 80 years, the legislature turning over as rapidly as it did. Listen, the public's not stupid, but what they need is information. And they're finally beginning to get on to what the problem is, that we've got too many people who think there's an endless well. And they think that when they run out of money, they can come back to the public and raise their taxes. Or if they don't raise their taxes, they disguise it as user fees or more tolls on bridges. Or if they can't do that, they sell more bonds. Enough. The public is now saying, enough. Money is finite. We got to make do with what we have, and if you, sir, cannot do it, step aside. We'll find someone else who can. That's what's going to be, I believe, the theme of the 1990s. You know, Peter Drucker wrote a very good book, and when it comes to managing business, he's the top business consultant. You know what he said? Especially when you have bad times, he said, less is more. When you start reducing the layers of overhead in these corporations, and you have fewer good people, you make more money. Why? Sometimes people step all over each other. And sometimes when you have people, too many, they want to justify their jobs, they're writing memos, they're creating forms, they got all kinds of procedures. What do you think is happening in government today? You mentioned the bureaucracy. Let me give you my definition of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is the process of turning energy into solid waste. Okay? That is my definition.
An excellent definition.
Okay, and what we got to be careful of is that in government, there's an attitude. I was there, I couldn't believe it. It's not the Drucker attitude, less is more. You know what it is? More is more. You know how you define power in government? More people, the size of the staff you have, the size of the budget you have. What did you spend last year? We'll give you another 5%. They don't say how you spent it last year. They don't get to the first dollar. Oh, you spent it all? Good. And if you don't spend it, guess what? You don't get it. So what do? They throw things off the ship because they don't want to end up with less next year than they had the year before. We have a mindless system. Again, as you mentioned, I'm the only practicing certified public accountant elected in 200 years to the House or Senate. So when I was there for 4 years, my eyes were trained. A nice, good accounting firm, one of the largest in the world, Arthur Andersen trained me. And I saw things that I could not believe that government is getting away with, but now I realize why. Because the public is not easily accessing the information it needs to make the decisions. But now it's gotten to the point where they start to see the saturation, and there's a lot that's floated to the surface. And you know what floats to the surface, right? So now we got to deal with the problem because we see it more than we've seen it before. And I think this is going to be good for America. You know, they say that in America you need usually a crisis to change things. Well, I hope we don't have a depression. I don't think we're going to have a depression. But when we did in 1929, my father came here from Italy during that depression, so I have vivid memories of what he said about it. And I hope that never happens again. But you know something? We have a pretty tough recession right now. I speak to my friends. This thing is not going away that easily. And it seems to me that this is the time we've got to address these issues because the public is starting to feel it. And when they feel it is when you have change.
Well, I'm concerned not only with the public, I'm concerned with foreign people and our own businesses. I came across some information this weekend, and I believe it's accurate information, that right now in the United States banking system, major corporations and foreign countries, lenders that were lending us money, are pulling out of our banks $500 billion a week. Now that's a tremendous amount of money. 500, I might say, wait a while, it might be 500 million a week.
Okay.
500 million a week. Yes, that's correct. 500 billion, we'd be bankrupt.
Still a lot of money.
No, 500 million a week. And the report said that Taiwan, over the last year, pulled 36 billion out. Now, why are these countries pulling out? Why are they taking their money out? Why are they reinvesting it in Japan? And why are they putting it in Germany? And why are they going into the European common market? There's something happening here.
Well, let me tell you,
because nobody is apprised of this. And what's going to happen is smart money is going to pull their monies out of the bank, and they're going to leave the little guy holding the bag, and I'm alarmed at that.
Well, I don't think they're pulling it out because they think America is not a safe place to be. But you know, there's an interesting connection between the deficit and between the trade deficit and the budget deficit. Let me put it another way. When we reduce interest rates in this country, what happens is you make investments abroad more attractive. Now, we know that we have to reduce interest rates here to get out of this recession. It's kind of like walking a very fine line. How far can you go reducing interest rates before major foreign entities, as you just said, start saying, hey, I can get more money, interest on my money if I put it abroad, so I take it out. But if they take it out with the deficits we have, who's going to replace the money in order to balance the books? Because we balance our budgets now, as you know, with debt. There's no question. And there's not enough money in this country. So we're forced to borrow overseas. So we're kind of getting right now in a catch-22. On the one hand, we want to reduce interest rates in order to jumpstart the economy, to get out of the recession. On the other hand, that makes our investing in the dollar less attractive. So we got to be careful here.
Congressman, you know, what's happening now in this country isn't something new. I mean, there was a time in Germany when the Reichsmark, you needed a barrel, a bushel full of Reichsmark to go buy a loaf of bread. Why? Because the German government kept inflating the dollar, inflating, or deflating, really, because they were printing money without anything in back of it. And this is my question. What do we, when we print billions, when we increase the debt limit, in other words, you said at night, 2 o'clock in the morning, they increase the debt limit, and they'll go from 4 trillion to 4.5 trillion, just like it's nothing. You know, passing it down to our great-great-grandchildren. But the point is, what are they printing? They're printing paper. What have they got to give on this paper? I studied economics at Brooklyn College, okay? And I learned that you have to produce something to have something. In order to make a profit, you have to produce something. You can't take nothing and make something. It's an impossible thing.
Okay, but we got to be careful we don't mix up the monetary policy with the fiscal policy of America. And I would tell you that, yes, when they raise the limit, they're doing something, but they haven't spent the money at that point. What they're saying then is that the fiscal policy of Congress can continue Because now what they can do is they can spend more, and if we don't have the money, this now allows them to issue new bonds to get the money. But, you know, you get to a point where that can have a deleterious effect on America because, like any other business enterprise or any other family, when your debt gets to the point where your cost to service that debt is more than you can afford. And how do you measure that? Well, if I buy a car, I know that I have a certain amount of payments to make. And I got to make those payments. And when I pay off a car, pay off a house, Joe, I'm paying off interest and principal. In America, we never pay off the principal. We're only paying interest, and still the interest now is what? This last year, $200 billion that we paid out. Well, that is really the entire deficit for the year 1990, as I recall, and it's going to be half the deficit for the year 1992, or a little bit more than half. Hey, that's a lot of money to be servicing. So the relationship that you make is a good one, but I give it a different twist in the sense that the servicing costs are huge, and that's what's going to bankrupt America. We cannot raise that money even to pay the interest on the national debt.
Congressman, you know what I think the problem is, and I'm speaking as a special kind of layman because I've had some economic training. The problem is when you shoot billions and trillions, people can't even imagine the zeros. I mean, the middle class is used to making $400 or $500 a week, maybe. And when they hear billions, it's out of their realm. They think it's crazy, even millions. How many people are millionaires? But let's relate this money to them. When you translate that interest, $200 billion, what does this come out of each and every citizen of the United States?
Excellent
What does it
point.
translate to?
Because, you know, I gave a speech, and I think you were there, where I personalized this issue by taking the entire budget of the United States of America, I guess as only a CPA could, and putting it in the form of a credit card statement. Because I said, if we've got a credit card that we gave our elected officials, then let's see where the credit card statement is. They should be showing us, but they don't. So I created it. And I took the number of taxpayers last year, which were almost 110 million. Those are the people who filed tax returns on April the 15th. Divided it into the numbers that we get from the Treasury. You start off to the year with $25,500 per taxpayer, their share of the national debt. So let's bring it down to the individual. Your share of the national debt at the beginning of last year was $25,500. Now, one of the items that increased that is your share on the interest on the national debt, which I call the finance charge. Because you know you get a finance charge and a credit card statement. And you know what that number was last year? $1,650 per person.
What will it be this year?
It's going to have to go higher. Now, you haven't paid it. You know why? Because elected officials don't have the nerve to raise your taxes for all of that, so what they do is they float these bonds to pay it off. But it is a tax because the next generation is going to have to pay it. Somewhere along the line, that's going to have to be paid, just like the money is going to have to be put into the Social Security trust funds. How could we get away with it now? Why? Because demographically speaking, more people are working relative to people retiring. But by the year 2010, the actuaries tell us more people are going to be retiring relative to those working. That's when there's going to be a run on the banks, a run on the Social Security fund. Where's the money going to come from? The kids in that generation are going to have to pay more taxes to put the money back that we spent.
Well, you know, you brought up about people and the people living to an older age, which is the truth. I mean, now the life expectancy of a woman is 78 years old and a man is 74. But there's another problem that is really insidious, and here's what it is. We've eliminated, since 1973, since Roe versus Wade came into effect, we've eliminated 22 million children. Now, some of those children would be 17 years old now, ready to go into the workforce. They're not going to be in that workforce. What we're doing is we're destroying the population pyramid. Normally, the older people took the smallest part, and the young people were the base. We're eliminating the base. We took 2/3 of the base away from our economy. And people never look at abortion in that sense. It's an economic problem. You look today and you say, well, our businesses are losing money. They can't make money. What's happening? Well, who needs more? If you raise kids, you know your kids run out of sneakers every 2 weeks. You got to buy sneakers. You got to buy dungarees. They eat like horses because they're growing. You need a gallon of milk a day for one kid. And what about people who have 4 or 5 kids? What do? So what are we doing? We took 22 million people, not only who would be productive people down the road, but who would be feeding our economy now. And we've eliminated them. And I don't think we deal with that. It's never been brought to the fore. We talk about a moral thing and pro-choice and pro-that, but people don't look at the economic consequences of Roe versus Wade.
It's an interesting way to look at it. There's no question people have referred to this as another Holocaust.
Well, it is a Holocaust, but it's an economic Holocaust. But what happens now as you lose 1.4 million people, children, every year? What happens as the base reduces and the top, the people who retire at 62 and 65, as they keep getting overbalanced? The pyramid collapses.
There's no question that those workers are not going to be there to replace that Social Security money, and this is the pressure that's going to be put on that trust fund in the year 2010.
Well, the point is, at one time there were 16 people, Congressman. You know, there were 16 people to service one person on Social Security. They say that in a couple of years there'll only be four putting into the Social Security to service one.
Well, let's hope that technological advances are going to make up for some of that slippage, but you're right, the demographics are changing rapidly, and when you look at the future, the next generation is not going to be able to afford the same size house as their fathers and mothers afforded. They're not going to be able to do with the quality of life that we had. There are going to have to be some sacrifices being made, and you know why? Because we have consumed our capital today. We haven't just consumed the fruit on this great tree called the United States of America. We're chipping away at the bark. And we got to stop that, because if you kill this tree, you not only killed a great system, but you kill a beacon of hope for the rest of the world, because this is truly the only democracy that has really worked. And that's something that we cannot afford to lose.
What can we do? You were there. What can we do?
Well, it's happening already. The voters are voicing their outrage at the voting booth. I've told the people as I go around America, take this card away from those legislators, Democrat or Republican. This is not a partisan issue. And this is not just an issue for the federal government, and cut this card. In fact, I go around America, when I give this speech, I have a big pair of pruning clips, and I tell people, if you don't have a card like this, you're not a congressman, bring up a credit card and let me cut it and put it in this box here. And I want to get a ton of these things and drop it on the stairs of the Capitol, like Howard Jarvis did back in the late 70s with his American tax revolt movement. You remember in Proposition 13? He brought 3 trailer loads of petitions. And that's when Congress got the message and they started listening. And Proposition 13 was implemented for that reason. So we got to cut the card. And we got to limit what we're doing when it comes to taxing and spending. And we've got to look under the numbers and see what works. Not just quantitative analysis, qualitative analysis. Don't tell me what we spent last year. Tell me how we spent it last year. Don't tell me just to add 2% or 5%. Tell me what was the waste so we can get rid of it, so we can do things that are right for America.
Well, Congressman, you've been very enlightening tonight, and like I said, this is a big